All right. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Tragedy and Hope live stream. We're on page 333. All right. These higher British prices serve to increase imports, decrease exports, and encourage an outflow of gold, which made gold reserves dangerously low. To maintain the gold reserve at all, it was necessary to keep the discount rate at a level so high, 4.5% or more, that business activity was discouraged. The only solution which the British government could see to this situation was continued deflation. This effort to drive down prices failed because the unions were able to prevent the drastic cutting of costs, chiefly wages, necessary to permit profitable production on such a deflationary market. Nor could the alternative method of deflation by heavy taxation be imposed to the necessary degree on the upper classes who were in control of the government. The showdown on the deflationary policy came in the general strike of 1926. The unions lost the strike. That is, they could not prevent the policy of deflation, but they made it impossible for the government to continue the reduction of cost to the extent necessary to restore business profits and the export trade. As a result of this financial policy, Britain found herself faced with deflation and depression for the whole period of 1920 to 1933. These effects were drastic in 1920 to 1922, moderate in 1922 to 1929, and drastic again in 1929 to 1933. The wholesale index price, 1913 equals 100, fell from 307 in 1920 to 197 in 1921, then declined slowly to 137 in 1928. Then it fell rapidly to 120 in 1929 to 90 in 1933. The number of unemployed averaged about 1.75 million for each of the 13 years of 1921 to 1932, and reached 3 million in 1931. At the same time, the inadequacy of the British gold reserve during most of the period placed Britain in financial subjugation to France, which had a plentiful supply of gold because of her different financial policy. This subjection served to balance the political subjection of France to Britain arising from French insecurity, and ended only with Britain's abandonment of the gold standard in 1931. Britain was the only important European country which reached stabilization through deflation. East of her, a second group of countries, including Belgium, France, and Italy, reached stabilization through devaluation. This was a far better method. It was adopted, however, not because of superior intelligence, but because of financial weakness. In these countries, the burden of war-damaged reconstruction made it impossible to balance a budget, and this made deflation difficult. These countries accepted orthodox financial ideas and tried to deflate in 1920 to 1921, but after the depression which resulted, they gave up the task. Belgium stabilized once at 107 francs to the pound sterling, but could not hold this level and had to devaluate further to 175 to the pound. October 1926. France stabilized at 124.21 francs to the pound at the end of 1926, although stabilization was made de jure only in June 1928. Italy stabilized at 92.46 liras to the pound sterling in December 1927. The group of countries which reached stabilization through devaluation prospered in contrast with those who reached stabilization through deflation. The prosperity was roughly equal to the degree of devaluation. Of the three Latin countries, Belgium, France, and Italy, Belgium devalued the most and was the most prosperous. Her stabilization was at a price level below the world level, so that the Belga was undervalued by about one-fifth. This served to encourage exports. For an industrial country such as Belgium, this made it possible for her to profit by the misfortunes of Britain. France was in a somewhat similar position. Italy, on the contrary, stabilized at a figure which made the lira considerably overvalued. This was done for purposes of prestige, Mussolini being determined to stabilize the lira at a higher value than that of the French franc. The effects of this overvaluation of the lira on the Italian economy were extremely adverse. Italy was never as prosperous after stabilization as she had been immediately before it. Not only did the countries which undervalued their money prosper, they decreased the disequilibrium between wealth and money. They were able to use the inflation to increase production. They escaped high taxes. They moderated or escaped the stabilization crisis and the deflationary depression. They improved their positions in the world markets in respect to high-cost countries like Britain, and they replenished their gold stocks. A third group of countries reached stabilization through reconstruction. These were the countries in which the old monetary unit had been wiped out and had to be replaced by a new monetary unit. Among these were Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia. The first two of these were stabilized by a program of international assistance worked out through the League of Nations. The last was forced to work out a financial system by herself. Germany had her system reorganized as a consequence of the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan, as we have seen in our discussion of reparations, provided the gold reserves necessary for a new currency and provided a control of foreign exchange which served to protect Germany from the accepted principles of orthodox finance. These controls were continued until 1930 and permitted Germany to borrow from foreign sources, especially the United States, the funds necessary to keep her economic system functioning with an unbalanced budget and an unfavorable balance of trade. In the period 1924 to 1929, by means of these funds, the industrial structure of Germany was largely rebuilt so that when the Depression arrived, Germany had the most efficient industrial machine in Europe and probably the second most efficient in the world after the United States. The German financial system had inadequate controls over inflation and almost none over deflation because of the Dawes Plan restrictions on the open market operations of the Reichsbank and the generally slow response of the German economy to changes in the discount rate. Fortunately, such controls were hardly necessary. The price level was at 137 in 1924 and at the same figure in 1929 when 1913 was equal to 100%. In that 6-year period, it had reached as high as 142 in 1925 and fallen as low as 134 in 1926. This stability in prices was accompanied by a stability in economic conditions. While these conditions were by no means booming, there was only one bad year before 1931. This was 1926, the year in which prices fell to 134 from the 1925 level of 142. In this year, unemployment averaged 2 million. The best year was 1925, in which unemployment averaged 636,000. This drop in prosperity from 1925 to 1926 was caused by a lack of credit as a result of the inadequate supplies of domestic credit and a temporary decline in the supplies of foreign credit. It was this short slump in business which led Germany to follow the road to technological reorganization. This permitted Germany to increase output without decreasing employment. The average annual increase in labor productivity in the period 1924 to 1932 in Germany was about 5%. Output per labor hour in industry rose from 87.8 in 1925 to 115.6 in 1930 and 125 in 1932. 1928 equals 100%. This increase in output served to intensify the impact of the Depression in Germany so that unemployment, which averaged about 3 million in the year 1930, reached over 6 million in late 1932. The implications of this will be examined in detail in our study of the rise to power of Hitler. The stabilization period did not end until about 1931, although only minor powers were still stabilizing in the last year or so. The last great power to stabilize de jure was France in June 1928, and she had been stabilized de facto much earlier. In the whole period, about 50 countries stabilized their currencies on the gold standard, but because of the quantity of gold necessary to maintain the customary reserve ratio, that is, pre-1914 ratios, at the higher prices generally prevailing during the period of stabilization, no important country was able to go back on the gold standard as the term was understood in 1914. The chief change was the use of the gold exchange standard or the gold bullion standard in place of the old gold standard. Under the gold exchange standard, foreign exchange of gold standard countries could be used as reserves against notes or deposits in place of reserves in gold. In this way, the world's limited supplies of gold could be used to support a much greater volume of fictitious wealth in the world as a whole, since the same quantity of gold could act as bullion reserve for one country and gold reserve for another, even those countries which stabilized on a direct gold standard did so in a quite different way from the situation in 1914. In few countries was there free and gratuitous convertibility between notes, coins, and bullion. In Great Britain, for example, by the Gold Standard Act of May 1925, notes could be exchanged for gold only in the form of bullion. And only in amounts of at least 400 fine ounces, that is, not less than $8,268 worth at a time. Bullion could be presented to the mint for coinage only by the Bank of England, although the bank was bound to buy all gold offered at 77 pounds sterling, I guess, per standard ounce. Notes could be converted into coin only at the option of the bank. Thus, the gold standard of 1925 was quite different from that of 1914. This would indicate that even in its most superficial aspects, the international gold standard of 1914 was not reestablished by 1930. The legal provisions were different, the financial necessities and practices were quite different, the profound underlying economic and commercial conditions were entirely different and becoming more so. Yet financiers, businessmen, and politicians tried to pretend to themselves and to the public that they had restored the financial system of 1914. They had created a facade of cardboard and tinsel which gave a vague resemblance to the old system, and they hoped that if they pretended vigorously enough, they could change this facade into the lost reality for which they yearned. At the same time, while pursuing policies such as tariffs, price controls, production controls, and so on, which drove this underlying reality even further from that which had existed in 1914, they besought other governments to do differently. Such a situation, with pretense treated as if it were reality and reality treated as if it were a bad dream, could lead only to disaster. This is what happened. The period of stabilization merged rapidly into a period of deflation and depression. As we have said, the stage of financial capitalism did not place emphasis on the exchange of goods or the production of goods as the earlier stages of commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism had done. In fact, financial capitalism had little interest in goods at all, but was concerned entirely with claims on wealth, stocks, bonds, mortgages, insurance, deposits, proxies, interest rates, and such. It invested capital not because it desired to increase the output of goods or services, but because it desired to float issues, frequently excess issues of securities, on this productive basis. It built railroads in order to sell securities, not in order to transport goods. It constructed great steel corporations to sell securities, not in order to make steel, and so on. But incidentally, it greatly increased the transport of goods, the output of steel, and the production of other goods. By the middle of the stage of financial capitalism, however, the organization of financial capitalism had evolved to a highly sophisticated level of security, promotion, and speculation, which did not require any productive investments as a basis. Corporations were built upon corporations in the form of holding companies, so that securities were issued in huge quantities, bringing profitable fees and commissions to financial capitalists without any increase in economic production whatever. That should probably be whatsoever, but whatever, I'm not an editor. Indeed, these financial capitalists discovered that they could not only make killings out of issuing such insecurities, they could also make killings out of the bankruptcy of such corporations through the fees and commissions of reorganization. A very pleasant cycle of flotation, bankruptcy began to be practiced by these financial capitalists. The more excessive the flotation, the greater the profits, and the more imminent the bankruptcy. The more frequent the bankruptcy, the greater the profits of reorganization, and the sooner the opportunity of another excessive flotation with its accompanying profits. This excessive stage reached its highest peak only in the United States. In Europe, it was achieved only in isolated cases. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and a use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups. This concentration of power, however, could be achieved only by using methods which planted the seeds which grew into monopoly capitalism. Financial control could be exercised only imperfectly through credit control and interlocking directorates. In order to strengthen such control, some measures of stock ownership was necessary, but stock ownership was dangerous to banks because their funds consisted more of deposits, that is, short-term obligations, than of capital or long-term obligations. This meant that banks which sought economic control through stock ownership were putting short-term obligations into long-term holdings. This was safe only so long as the latter could be liquidated rapidly at a price high enough to pay short-term obligations as they presented themselves. But these holdings of securities were bound to become frozen because both the economic and financial systems were deflationary. The economic system was deflationary because power production and modern technology gave a great increase in the supply of real wealth. This meant that in the long run, the control by banks was doomed by the progress of technology. The financial system was also deflationary because of bankers' insistence on the gold standard, with all that it implies. To escape from this dilemma, the financial capitalists acted upon two fronts. On the business side, they sought to sever control from ownership of securities, believing they could hold the former and relinquish the latter. On the industrial side, they sought to advance monopoly and restrict production, thus keeping prices up and their security holdings liquid. All right, gotta put a post-it note on that. The efforts of financiers to separate ownership from control were aided by the great capital demands of modern industry. Such demands for capital made necessary the corporation form of business organization. This inevitably brings together the capital owned by a large number of persons to create an enterprise controlled by a small number of persons. The financiers did all they could to make the former number as large as possible and the latter number as small as possible. The former was achieved by stock splitting, issuing securities of low par value, and by high-pressure security salesmanship. The latter was achieved by plural voting stock, non-voting stock, pyramiding of holding companies, election of directors by co-optation, and similar techniques. The results of this was that larger and larger aggregates of wealth fell into the control of smaller and smaller groups of men. While financial capitalism was thus weaving the intricate pattern of modern corporation law and practice on one side, it was establishing monopolies and cartels on the other. Both helped to dig the grave of financial capitalism and pass the reins of economic control onto the newer monopoly capitalism. On one side, the financiers freed the controllers of business from the owners of business, but on the other side, this concentration gave rise to monopoly conditions which freed the controllers from the banks. The date at which any country shifted to financial capitalism and later shifted to monopoly capitalism depended on the supply of capital available to business. These dates could be hastened or retarded by government action. In the United States, the onset of monopoly capitalism was retarded by the government's anti-monopoly legislation, while in Germany it was hastened by the cartel laws. The real key to the shift rested on the control of money flows, especially of investment funds. These controls, which were held by investment bankers in 1900, were eclipsed by other sources of funds and capital, such as insurance, retirement, and investment funds, and above all by those flows resulting from the fiscal policies of government. Effort by the older private investment bankers to control these new channels of funds had varying degrees of success, but in general, financial capitalism was destroyed by two events. One, the ability of industry to finance its own capital needs because of the increased profits arising from the decreased competition established by financial capitalism, and the economic crisis engendered by the deflationary policies resulting from financial capitalism's obsession with the gold standard. Let me see how long this section is. The period of deflation 1927 to 1936. The period of stabilization cannot be clearly distinguished from the period of deflation. In most countries, the period of deflation began in 1921 and, after about 4 or 5 years, became more rapid in its development, reaching after 1929 a degree which could be called acute. In the first part of this period, 1921 to 1925, the dangerous economic implications of deflation were concealed by a structure of self-deception which pretended that a great period of economic process would be inaugurated as soon as the task of stabilization had been accomplished. This psychological optimism was completely unwarranted by the economic facts, even in the United States, where these economic facts were, for the short term at least, more promising than anywhere else. After 1925, when the deflation became more deep rooted and economic conditions worsened, the danger from these conditions was concealed by a continuation of unwarranted optimism. The chief symptom of the unsoundness of the underlying economic reality, the steady fall in prices, was concealed in a later period, 1925 to 1929, by a steady rise in security prices, which was erroneously regarded as a good sign, and by the excessive lending abroad of the United States, which amounted to almost $10 billion in the period 1920 to 1931, bringing our total foreign investment to almost $27 billion by the end of 1930. This foreign lending of the United States was the chief reason why the maladjusted economic conditions could be kept concealed for so many years. Before the war, the United States had been a debtor nation, and to pay these debts, had developed an exporting economy. The combination of debtor and exporter is a feasible one. The war made the United States a creditor nation and also made her a greater exporter than ever by building up her acreage of cotton and wheat and her capacity to produce ships, steel, textiles, and so on. The resulting combination of creditor and exporter was not feasible. The United States refused to accept either necessary alternative to reduce debts owed to her or to increase her imports. Instead, she raised tariffs against imports and temporarily filled the gap with huge foreign loans. But this was hopeless as a permanent solution. As a temporary solution, it permitted the United States to be both creditor and exporter. It permitted Germany to pay reparations with neither a budgetary surplus nor a favorable balance of trade. It permitted dozens of minor countries to adopt a gold standard they could not hold. It permitted France, Britain, Italy, and others to pay war debts to the United States without sending goods. In a word, it permitted the world to live in a fairyland of self-delusions remote from economic realities. These realities were characterized by a. Fundamental maladjustments to both economic and financial, which made it impossible for the financial system to function as it had in 1914, and b. The steady deflation. The fundamental maladjustments were both economic and financial. The economic maladjustments were those which we have already indicated: the industrialization of colonial areas, the overproduction of raw materials and food as a result of wartime high prices, the overexpansion of heavy industry as a result of wartime needs, the obsolescence of much of heavy industry in Europe and in Britain, which made it impossible to compete with newer equipment or to cope with the shifts in consumer demand, and the steadily increasing disadvantage of producers of raw materials and food in contrast with producers of industrial goods. To these old factors were added new ones, such as the great increase in productive efficiency in Germany and the United States, the return of Russia and Germany to the European economy about 1924, and the return of Europe to the world economy in the period 1925 to 1927. Many countries sought to resist these factors, both old and new, by adopting political interference with economic life in the form of tariffs, import quotas, export subsidies, and so on. The financial maladjustments served to create an insufficiency of gold and a maldistribution of gold. The inadequacy of the supply of gold arose from several causes. It had been estimated that the world's stock of gold money needed to increase by 3.1% per year in the 1920s to support the world's economic development with stable prices on the gold standard. The production of new gold after 1920 was below this rate. Moreover, as the result of the activities of the League of Nations and financial advisors like Professor E.W. Kimmerer of Princeton University, every country was encouraged to get on the gold standard. This led to a gold rush as each country tried to obtain a supply of gold large enough to provide adequate reserves. Because there were more countries on gold in 1928 than in 1914, and because prices in general were higher, more gold was needed in reserves. The efforts to get around this by using a gold exchange standard rather than a gold standard were helpful in dealing with the problem of inadequate supplies of gold, but increased the difficulty of the problem of maldistribution of gold, since the gold exchange standard did not respond to the flow of gold as readily and thus did not serve so well to stem such flows of gold. The need for gold was made greater by the existence of large floating balances of political or panic funds, which might well move from one market to another independent of economic conditions. The need was increased by the fact that in 1920 there were three major financial centers which had to make payments by shipments of gold, in contrast to the single financial center of 1914. Where payments could be made by bookkeeping transactions. To rectify this problem to some degree, the Bank for International Settlements was created in 1929, but never functioned as its founders had hoped. Finally, the need for gold was increased by the enormous growth in foreign indebtedness, much of it of a political nature, such as the war debts and reparations. On top of this insufficiency of gold was superimposed a drastic maldistribution of gold. This was conclusive proof that the financial system of 1914 had broken down, for the old system would have to be operated automatically to distribute the gold evenly. This maldistribution resulted from the fact that when gold flowed into certain countries, the automatic results of such a flow, such as rising prices or falling interest rates, which would have restored equilibrium in 1914, were prevented from acting in 1928. In this period, about 4/5 of the world's gold supply was in 5 countries, and over half was in 2, the United States and France. The gold had been brought to these 2 for quite different reasons. To the United States because it was the world's greatest creditor, and to France because of its devaluation of the franc. Britain, on the other hand, had floating balances of about 800 million pounds and handled each year 20,000 million in transactions with a gold reserve of only 150 million pounds. And such a situation made it possible for France to use gold as a political weapon against Britain. As a result of these conditions and the deflationary economic conditions described in Chapter 11, prices began to fall, at first slowly and then with increasing rapidity. The turning point in most countries was in 1925 to 1926, with Great Britain one of the earliest, January 1925. In the first half of 1929, this slow drift downward began to change to a rapid drop. The following table will show the changes in wholesale prices for 5 principal countries. All right, there's a chart here on page 341. We're showing the different years and the price of gold. I'm not really going to go through that. The economic effects of these soft prices after 1925 were adverse, but these effects were concealed for a considerable period because of the various influence, especially the liberal credit policies of the United States, both foreign and domestic, and the optimism engendered by the stock market boom. The facade of prosperity over unsound economic conditions was practically worldwide. Only in France and the United States was it a boom with real wealth, but in the latter it was by no means as great as one might think from a glance at stock prices. In Britain, the boom appeared in the form of the flotation of new stocks of unsound and fraudulent companies and a minor stock market boom, about one-third as fast a rise in securities as in the United States. In Germany and in much of Latin America, the boom was based upon foreign borrowing, chiefly from the United States, the proceeds of which were largely put into non-productive construction. In Italy, held down by the overvaluation of the lira in 1927, the boom was of short duration. The crash of 1929. The history of the slump begins about 1927 when France stabilized the franc de facto at a level at which it was devalued and undervalued. This led to a great demand for francs. The Bank of France sold francs in return for foreign exchange. The francs were created as credit in France, thus giving an inflationary effect, which can be seen in the behavior of French prices in 1926 to 1928. The foreign exchange which France received for its francs was largely left in that form without being converted into gold. By 1928, the Bank of France found that it held foreign exchange to the value of 32 billion francs, about 1.2 billion. At this point, the Bank of France began to transfer its exchange holdings into gold, buying the metal chiefly in London and New York. Because of the inadequate gold reserves in London, a meeting of central bankers in New York decided that the gold purchases of France and Germany should be diverted from London to New York in the future, July 1927. To prevent the resulting outflow of gold from having a deflationary effect, which might injure businesses, the New York Federal Reserve Bank dropped its discount rate from 4% to 3.5%. When the French gold purchases became noticeable in 1928, the Federal Reserve Bank adopted open market operations to counterbalance them, buying securities to a value equal to the French purchases of gold. As a result, there was no reduction in money in the United States. This money, however, was going increasingly into stock market speculation rather than into production of real wealth. This can be seen from the following tables of indices of average stock prices for both England and the United States in the years indicated. So it's got a chart on page 343 showing the industrial share prices. You can check that out. It's basically what he was just talking about on the last page. The stock market boom in the United States was really much more drastic than is indicated by these index numbers, because these are yearly averages and include sluggish stocks as well as market leaders. The boom began as far back as 1924, as can be seen, and reached its peak in the fall of 1929. By the spring of 1929, it had become a frenzy and was having profound effects on business activity, on domestic and international finance, on the domestic affairs of foreign countries, and on the psychology and modes of life of Americans. The financial results of the stock market boom were the following. In the United States, credit was diverted from production to speculation, and increasing amounts of funds were being drained from the economic system into the stock market, where they circulated around and around, building up the prices of securities. In Germany, it became increasingly difficult to borrow from the United States, and the foreign loans, which kept the German financial system and the whole system of reparations and war debts functioning, were shifted from long-term loans to precarious short-term credits. The results of this have been examined in the chapter on reparations. In other countries, funds tended to flow to the United States where they could expect to roll up extraordinary earnings and capital gains in a relatively short time. This was especially true of funds from Britain, where the stock market boom ceased after the end of 1928. By that time, the fundamentally unsound economic conditions were beginning to break through the facade. The decline in foreign loans by both London and New York began to be noticeable by the last half of 1928 and made it evident that the chief support of the facade was vanishing. But the continued rise of security prices in New York continued to draw money from the rest of the world and from the productive and consumptive systems of the United States itself. Early in 1929, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System became alarmed at the stock market speculation, especially at its draining credit from industrial production. To curtail this, in April 1929, the Federal Reserve authorities called upon the member banks to reduce their loans on stock exchange collateral. At the same time, it engaged in open market operations, which reduced its holdings of banker acceptances from about 300 million to about 150 million. The sterilization of gold was made more drastic. It was hoped in this way to reduce the amount of credit available for speculation. Instead, the available credit went more and more to speculation and decreasingly to productive business. Call money rates in New York, which had reached 7% at the end of 1928, were at 13% by June 1929. In that month, the election of a Labour government in England so alarmed the British capital that large amounts flowed to the United States and contributed further to the speculative frenzy. In August, the Federal Reserve discount rate was raised to 6%. By this time, it was becoming evident that the prices of stocks were far above any value based on earning power, and that this earning power was beginning to decline because of the weakening of industrial activity. At this critical moment, on September 26, 1929, a minor financial panic in London, the Hatry case, caused the Bank of England to raise its bank rate from 4.5% to 6.5%. This was enough. British funds began to leave Wall Street and the overinflated market commenced to sag. By the middle of October, the fall had become a panic. In the week of October 21st, the stock exchange and the Curb Exchange in New York, total stocks sold averaged over 9 million a day, and on Tuesday, October 24th, almost 19.25 million shares changed hands. The shrinkage in values was measured by several $billion a day. Some stocks fell by 100 or even 140 points in a day. Auburn fell 210 points, General Electric 76 points, and U.S. Steel 26 points in 4.5 days. By November 6th, these three stocks had fallen respectively 55, 78, and 28 points more. It was a financial disaster of unparalleled magnitude. The stock market crash reduced the volume of foreign lending from the United States to Europe, and these two events together tore away the facade which until then had concealed the fundamental maladjustments between production and consumption, between debts and ability to pay, between creditors and willingness to receive goods, between the theories of 1914 and the practices of 1928. Not only were these maladjustments revealed, but they began to be readjusted with a severity of degree and speed made all the worse by the fact that the readjustments had been so long delayed. Production began to fall to the level of consumption, creating idle men, idle factories, idle money, and idle resources. Debtors were called to account and found deficient. Creditors who had refused payment now sought it. but in vain. All values of real wealth shrank drastically. All right, I'm just going to stop reading there. On page 345, the next section is the crisis of 1931. That ought to be super exciting. Not really much going on in that section, just a bunch of inflation and deflation, but you can see how they switched over from the financial capitalism to the monopoly capitalism by using the stock market to increase the amount of investments and not having to get investments directly from private banks, while like I guess what's the word, I don't know, minimizing the amount of people that are actually in control of the money through the CEO boards of the companies. So, and then there's a lot of pump and dump stuff going on and all that other type of stuff. But you can see this is how United States became like the world's currency, and we just print debt money, debt-based money. It kind of makes sense. Seems like everything is pivoting on this whole like World War I, World War II period though in history. Well, I'm gonna get out of here. Thanks for watching the video. If you did, if you didn't, I don't know what to say to you because you're not gonna hear this. All right. Have a good day, and I'll talk to you later. Peace.